Hello. Welcome to Get Your Data in Line, the journey from data chaos to regulatory and compliance zen. I'm Janine Darling, the CEO of Stash Data Protection. And what I'd like to do today is to get a lot of the chaos out of the way, and by the end of this presentation, hope that you'll have a very clear journey to a data compliance strategy that will help you to do business in a way that is much easier than ever before. So why don't we get started, because we've got a lot of material to get through. One housekeeping issue. If you have questions about any of the information that's about to be presented, please do put them into the question screen on BrightTALK, and I will address them at the end of the presentation. So don't worry if I'm not reacting to you slide by slide. What I'd like to do is get through all the data and then answer questions, because I'm sure that whatever questions arise, more people than just you will have the same question. So let's get started. If you're responsible for data in your business today, you are facing many, many challenges, but three of them in particular are the ones that are on my mind today to help you to get to the next step. First, the volume of data that you are dealing with is massive, and it's growing, doubling really every couple of years. And although 75% of that data is generated by individuals, it's really businesses' responsibility to protect 80% of that data at some point or another. The second critical challenge is that the rising number of platforms and devices which your business data is being stored and transmitted on. A Juniper Network survey recently found that 40% of employees are using personal mobile devices to access company data. And the Polemon Institute found 35% of business data is stored in the cloud. And almost half of that data is not controlled by a company. The last challenge is that maintaining responsibility for this increasing volume of corporate data and keeping track of it across all those devices and cloud apps, and protecting your network from cyber criminals in the process is another issue to think about. Regulators and their regulations will be paying close attention to all of these things and how you are compliant with them. So let's talk about what regulatory compliance really means. Regulatory controls the way that a business can operate. It's all the laws, both internal and external, that a company pays attention to. With compliance, of course, we're talking about the external rules. And compliance is conforming to those outside rules, such as a specification, policy, standard, or law. It isn't that your employees aren't encouraged to comply with internal laws, but it's the external ones that we're going to be talking about today, because those are the ones that can get you in real trouble. So regulatory compliance is organizations aspiring to achieve in their efforts all the steps that it takes to comply with relevant laws, policies, and regulations. I think that every company is always thinking about how to do business in the best way. But because of all the data that we are now processing that is so critical to how we live our business lives, regulatory compliance is front and center and has become hyper-focused on what we're doing with all that data. So why don't we start with the data? Because in one way or another, regulatory compliance comes down to data and where it's stored, how much of it there is, what format it's stored in, whether it's accessible or not, and whether it's vulnerable to cyber crimes. What exactly is data? So interestingly enough, data in general takes on these two major forms. There is unstructured data, which is the kind of data that you can store in a folder, right? So videos and spreadsheets and documents and audios and movies and anything that you can think of that you could actually put in a folder. And structured data is, in short, the kind of data that you find in databases. So you can see that format there. It's all, numbers and code. And that format turns into unstructured data. For instance, if you take a screenshot of the data, and then you can store it in a folder. So structured data is rather organic, and unstructured data is really kind of structured. So it's an interesting turn of events because the descriptions of each kind of data almost sounds like the reverse of what it really is. There's also something called semi-structured data, but these are the two kinds of data that are most prevalent. Most of business data is unstructured data, 85% of it right now. Some people and some experts say that that's really 90% now. But for a conservative viewpoint, we're moving into 95% of the data we use for business will be unstructured data within the next 4 years. And how much data is that? Well, it's a lot. I know that all of us are familiar with kilobytes and megabytes and gigabytes and terabytes, but then we get into the really, really, really large amounts of data. Each time that you move up into a new definition or new tier of data, you're looking at about 1,000 times plus the previous tier of data. So, for instance, if you want to visualize what this data looks like, a megabyte is about 4 books of plain text, 875 pages or so. Or 2 megabytes is a high-resolution photograph. A gigabyte is a pickup truck filled with paper or a non-HD movie. So kind of an interesting visual there, the pickup truck and then that small HD movie, and yet there's the same amount of data. In contrast, 10 terabytes is the entire printed collection of the U.S. Library of Congress. A petabyte is 20 million 4-door filing cabinets full of text, or 500 billion pages of standard printed text. It's also the number of songs that would last over 2,000 years playing continuously. So data is an interesting thing, and it expands exponentially, as you can see. For another perspective on data, Google processes 24 petabytes of data a day. 24 petabytes is equal to the DNA of everyone in Australia, plus 26 clones of each person. That is a lot of data. So how much data is there in the world? More data than we could even almost imagine. So again, I'm going to give you some visuals to understand how much we're talking about here. 1 exabyte is 250 million DVDs worth of information. 5 exabytes is all the words ever spoken by human beings. And Cisco has estimated that there is 1.5 zettabytes of internet traffic annually. So you can see that zettabytes are enormous, enormous, enormous tiers of data, and that they are growing exponentially and will be from 2016 to 2025. They're estimated to grow 10 times compared to from beginning to end. So where's all that data coming from? Well, interestingly enough, this data is coming from an estimated 3 billion people who are connected to the internet right now. And by 2025, there will be 5 billion people through 100 billion connected devices. This explosion of data in the amount, variety, and importance is the real challenge for most companies, and most companies are not prepared to deal with it. But hopefully, when we're done with this presentation, you'll have a better handle on how to do so. According to the IDC's projections, the size of global storage capacity relative to the amount of data generated is expected to decline by half by 2020. So in less than a year and a half, maybe a couple of years, from 33% to 15%. So storage capacity, too, is a challenge, and we'll get to more details about that a little further into this presentation. But in many ways, we are running out of storage. But there are solutions for that, hopefully, and we'll talk about that. So let's talk about where data is created. And I just want to tell you what core, edge, and endpoint refers to. Endpoint, I think most people know, refers to the devices on the edge of the network. So these are all your PCs, your phones, your cameras, your connected cars, your wearables, and believe it or not, your refrigerators, your home heating and cooling systems, your sensors, all kinds of things that are connected. This is the IoT, the Internet of Things. Those are what endpoints are. The edge refers to enterprise hardened computers and appliances that are not in core data centers. This includes things like server rooms, servers in the field, smaller data centers regionally, and these create faster response times between endpoints and the core. And the core refers to designated data centers in the enterprise cloud. This includes all varieties of cloud computing, including public, private, and hybrid cloud, and also the operational control centers, such as those running the electric grid or telephone networks. So you can see that what is happening here is that data is, from the endpoint perspective, is going to decline a little bit as the years go by, and that the edge is going to double by 2025. And the edge is something that is a real mover. It's an emerging kind of data transmission, and something that we're going to be counting on more as a society as the years go by. The next thing that's interesting, I think, about this slide is where data is stored. And you can see that, again, enterprise is the place where most data is stored. Entertainment is big, and it's going to get a little bit smaller in the next 10 years or so. And that also the data stored on personal devices, computers and whatnot, because of edge computing, is going to decline as well. So enterprise has the bulk of the responsibility of where data is stored, and that data will continue to grow over the next few years. So the evolution of data from business background to life critical is again growing exponentially. Once siloed, remote, inaccessible, and mostly underutilized, data has become essential to our society in our individual lives. It used to be that data was something that we used, collected, saved or not, and it was interesting and important for education and running a business and all the things that we use data for. But now, without the data that we are gathering in big data or in data lakes, or the data that is transmitted between devices and between people and between countries, we cannot live. And so data has become critical. It is like our lifeblood. It is as important as oxygen is to us as human beings. The IDC estimates that by 2025, nearly 20% of the data in the global data sphere will be critical to our daily lives, and nearly 10% of that data will be hypercritical. That means we cannot live without it. We use data from infrastructure to education to banking to medical devices to autonomous cars and more. Huge improvements in connectivity require real leaps in real-time and mobile data access and the ability to leverage that data. So we're moving faster and faster into a completely data-dependent world. Let's talk for a moment about the implications of the Internet of Things. So as you can see, again, it is estimated that in 2020, the average connected person anywhere in the world will be interacting with connected devices a little over 600 times a day. But by 2025, again, because of the critical nature of data, that will be over 4,800 times per day. And you will see, as we continue to move through this presentation, that most of that data is important in ways that are becoming absolutely important to everything that we do, and that most of it will be regulated, and that a lot of it needs to be secure. By 2025, 90% of the data in the world will need to be protected in some way. However, at that time, only about 45% of it will actually be protected. And this is why we are talking about regulatory compliance. Because if a company is not paying attention to their data and is not regulating it and complying with external regulations about that data, it doesn't just affect that company. It affects every company and every individual that that company is connected to. So you can see where we're going with this. All this data from new sources opens up new vulnerabilities to private and sensitive information, and there's a huge gap between the amount of data being produced today that requires security and the amount of data that is actually being secured, and the gap is widening. Security is a regulatory hyper-focus now and will be even more so in the future. So how do you handle all of this? Well, let's talk about the journey that we're going to start now from data chaos to data zen. First things first. Where's your data? About 50% of companies don't know where their data is, and this is a little play on words. Actually, companies know that their data is in many places. But the thing that they don't know is where the specific data is in which place or places, and because they don't know, They also don't know what they have, how valuable it is, and whether it's been compromised or if it is even usable. So where do you look for that data and where do you find it? There's a lot of places to look. You need to look locationally. You need to look at objects. And you need to identify and monitor everything that is a critical business asset. And I can imagine that you're thinking right now, oh my goodness, I can't even imagine getting started with this and what I'm going to do when I find all this data. But stay calm, because although this sounds like a lot, the process itself is really very linear and very simple, and I think you'll feel better about it as we get to the end. So let's talk a little bit about something called dark data. Because dark data is one of the things that is a real challenge when it comes to regulatory compliance. In every company, regardless of size, there are proportionally large repositories of unstructured, untagged, and untapped data that has not been analyzed or processed. It's similar to big data, but it differs in how it is neglected by business in terms of its value. Gartner refers to this data as dark data, the information that organizations collect, process, and store during regular business activities, but generally fail to use for other purposes. Stating dark data that it's outlived its shelf life and utility to your business is sloppy at best and dangerous at worst. Remember about the not knowing what you don't have or what you do have? How pervasive is dark data? Well, a recent survey found an average that 54% of an organization's data is stale. And that adds to storage costs, wasted resources, data management complications, security risks, and yes, compliance issues. If your dark data holds, for example, a Word document with employee PII or an Excel file with customer payment information, your organization may be violating regulations such as GDPR, HIPAA, SOX, otherwise known as HIPAA, of course, SOX, PCI DSS, and others. Unfortunately, many companies don't know this data is even on their network and fail to secure it. In the event of a breach, attackers will zero in on this data and regulators will demand answers. So in a very simple way, these are the places that you will find your data. They're in the places you think that they're going to be, your cloud environments, your company server environments, your company endpoints, and the endpoints that you're connected to. But the places where you're going to find a lot of data and where a lot of dark data lives is your bring your own device and third-party applications, your portable drives, your paper records, right? Lots and lots of companies are still using paper. There's a lot of talk about the cloud, how everybody's going to the cloud, and in about 5 years, in order to do business, you will need to be in the cloud, and your data will be in a cloud environment, or you won't be able to do business with customers or other businesses. It's in fax machines. People are still using fax machines. Not everybody is using digital fax. It's in phone logs. It's kind of every place. So there's a lot of places that you need to look. After you find all that data, you need to classify it. All right? And there is a very standard classification model for data, and this is basically what it is. It is public, internal, confidential, and top secret data. And this data will differ from market segment and industry, from company size, but the adverse business impact of a data compromise on this data is extreme. And for the purposes of this presentation, when I'm talking about data compromise, I'm talking about data that is accessed and stolen, but also data loss, data manipulation, data harm, or data ransom, right? That's a huge data compromise when you can't get to your data. So data that is put in jeopardy with outcomes that range from bad to catastrophic. Those are the things that I am talking about. When you don't classify your data, what it means is that all your data, the stuff that's most valuable, and the stuff that you're using on a day-to-day basis. So valuable and just, regular business data that helps you to do your job is all together. And what that causes is a situation where data is easily misused. So you can see from these examples, there's all kinds of ways that people inadvertently misuse data, but then there's also ways that people intentionally misuse data. And we will get to that in some of the next slides as well. Another thing that happens when data is not classified is that it really is a threat to the business. When you do have a breach and your data is stolen, it's not just about the breach itself. Depending upon the brand equity that you've developed for your company, it could cause a real loss in company value. It can cause customer loyalty to really diminish. About 35% of customers after a breach with a brand that is well known will look for another brand to work with and will leave, and another 50% will be looking to leave. And those are the costs that a lot of companies don't talk about or don't even know how large they are when there is a public notification of a breach at their company. So after you classify data, you need to silo it and evaluate it. So believe it or not, we are running out of room to store data. And the thing about that is that it impacts business in a couple of ways. Number one, it's very, very, very easy to save data. That's why there is so much data. We manufacture it, we put it someplace, and we forget about it. And this is a problem because digital storage is not extrapolating as fast as we are creating data. How we're going to manage this in the future is we're going to need to move into a method of storing data that is not all in the cloud. Some of it is going to have to be outside the cloud, and it will rely on three primary levers. Storage policy about what to store and for how long, data reduction techniques such as deduplication and compression, and automated storage tiering, which distributes data across flash, disk, or tape depending on the data's priority and how often you need to access it. What data to save from a volume, capacity, and regulatory perspective to utilize storage becomes critical. We can't afford to save it all, and we can't possibly afford, in terms of time, effort, resources, and money, to ensure that it is regulatory compliant. So here's the thing. There is a lot of data at every company that is basically useless. Either nobody has looked at it in a long time, or it is not usable. It's old information. It's not usable anymore. So you can see that there's a huge amount of the data environment that hasn't been modified or looked at in a very long time. You need to be merciless about getting rid of files. For example, the orphan file environment is huge and takes up an inordinate amount of space. Orphan data is data without an associated owner. For instance, when an employee turnover or role switches or anything happens within the company where there is a change in employment. So the data that was associated with that employee is still there, But when the employee leaves or changes positions, that data basically becomes either unfindable or unusable. And orphan files are usually over 200% larger than average files. Managers tend to believe that the larger the file, the more important its contents, and subsequently only keep the dense items when employees go on their way. And if you want to recover storage space, reduce cost, and find valuable information with ease, focusing on content without an owner is a good place to start. Making sure that data is discarded properly is another element of regulation and compliance. So there are lots and lots of services, from self-service to automated to third party, that will help make this job easier, because you will find that there is a lot of data that you're going to want to get rid of. Not only so that you won't have these kinds of headaches in the future, but because some of the data, while it may be regulatory enforceable, again, is old, and you don't want to keep it anymore, and you don't want the expense, and you don't want the headache of having to pay attention to it. So depending on your industry or market segment, there's likely a regulation you need to know about and adhere to as it applies to data disposal. So when you get to the point where you're ready to dispose of data, you really should pay attention to the regulations that apply to your industry. And don't forget about the hardware. Computers, fax machines, laptops, DVDs, portable devices, company-issued phones, and other devices all have regulatory dependencies. Find out which ones apply, and due diligence your third-party partners to ensure that they are compliant in relationship to your hardware. So what's left? What's left is a regulatory and compliance program. So once you have found all your data, you have classified it, you have siloed and reviewed it, you have gotten rid of what you don't need, and you've gotten rid of the hardware that was storing it, now you're ready to have a formalized compliance program in place, which is comprised of components that inform, educate, monitor, enforce, and respond to regulatory compliance matters. This is a written law specific to your company on how regulatory compliance will be supported. It's usually led by a compliance officer in a mid-market or enterprise-sized company, and likely the head of operations in the smaller ones. What this plan usually generates is action items. And I know this looks like a lot, but it is really very linear, and everything is integrated into the other. This is called an IT asset management program, and this kind of program is the set of business practices that join financial, contractual, and inventory functions together to support the life cycle management of the company and the strategic decision making for all data assets. There are lots of rules that every company needs to pay attention to. And what happens is they start at the government level. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States sets the stage in the U.S., and there are other government regulations worldwide, and everything about compliance and regulations begins with them. In the U.S., every state has its own regulations pertaining to data compliance. And depending upon, again, what market segment or industry that you're in, those rules will be different for each of you. And so it's really, really important to start at the top and understand what your government rules are, then silo down to the state rules, and then last but not least, There are lots and lots of regulations worldwide, all right, more than 20,000 regulations that apply to data. And they're different, again, according to industry, according to company size, according to all kinds of things. So if you're doing business in the world, for instance, the payment card industry standards are global, right? So those standards, if you are taking payment from customers or working with money in any capacity, those payment card standards are ubiquitous. However, for other data, you will see that things are quite different from industry to industry. And last but not least, there is GDPR. And I know that there's a fair amount of confusion about GDPR because a lot of people still believe if you're a U.S. company or your headquarters in the U.S. that GDPR is not something you have to pay attention to, but this can be a really, really costly mistake. Under something called Article 3 of GDPR, any company is subject to the new law if it processes personal data of an individual residing in the EU, where the data is accessed. This is the case when processing relates to the offering of goods or services or the monitoring of behavior that takes place in the EU. For example, GDPR can apply if no financial transactions occur. For example, if your organization is a U.S. company with an internet presence, selling or marketing products over the web, or even merely offering a marketing survey globally, you may be subject to GDPR. The European Union is very, very serious about this law. And as you can see, the consequences are quite costly. And what I'd like to emphasize is this consequence of non-compliance or a data breach or something that happens with your data that doesn't comply with GDPR, this is a per incidence consequence. Not if you have a bunch of incidents in a year, this is per incident. So you can see how it can be very, very costly not to pay attention to this. So this is a lot, and I know it's a lot of information, but it comes down to a few things. Know your rules. Know the rules that apply to your industry, to your company within that industry, to the kinds of things that you do in your business with your data that need to be regulated. So what is on this slide is a variety of different rules. Some of them I know people are familiar with and some of them that you're not. I'm going to even call out a couple that aren't on this slide just because I think that they're interesting. For instance, there's an FDA rule called Part 11 that requires drug makers and biotech companies and other FDA-regulated industries to implement controls, including audits, validations, electronic signatures, and documentation for software and systems involved in processing electronic data. The Gramm-Leach-Lilly Act is also called the Financial Modernization Act of 1999, and it includes provisions to protect consumers' personal financial information held in companies broadly defined as financial institutions. You'd be surprised at the definition of financial institutions. It's not just banks and the stock market. It is also companies, retail companies, that sell things to people. So it's really quite interesting. The last one I'm going to talk about is Basel II, which is an international business standard that requires financial institutions to maintain enough cash reserves to cover risk incurred by operations. According to a series of recommendations on banking laws and regulations issued by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, this means that banks must keep enough cash on hand so that if there's a run on banks, that people will be able to get their money out. And I think that we know that this one has been and continues to be a challenge. And everybody knows about HIPAA, but I wonder if you know about HIPAA has an expanded format called the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, and that is the HITECH Act. And that broadens the scope and the rigor of HIPAA compliance. It means stricter regulations for breach notification, encryption as a recognized methodology of protecting personal health information, and other things. So you can see that there's a lot to pay attention to, but all you need to pay attention to are the ones that apply to your organization. Protecting your data. This is a very, very, very hot thing right now. Everybody is using a lot of different tools to try and protect data as much as you can. The problem with this is that you can no longer defend data. There is no perimeter. No matter how many tools are being used, I think that most people can vouch for the fact that you've either had a breach or two in your company, or you know that a breach is not an if or a when, but is a how many times at this juncture in the data life. So there are some emerging technologies that are addressing this issue in a really useful way, and they are called data-centric, and basically what they do is protect the data bytes themselves. So if data is compromised, if data is accessed by a malicious actor or algorithm, all that will be found are unreadable pieces of data. And the best data-centric solutions actually take your data and don't only encrypt it, but they turn it into little bits and they store it in multiples in multiple places. So no matter what happens, you always have a copy of your most important data. And as you can see, I have a quote from Gartner here, but it's not only Gartner that is speaking to this. It is Forrester and IDC and a bunch of the other security thought leader organizations and experts say that this is the way to mitigate threats and compliance issues to critical data, that if you don't have a data-centric component amongst your security methods, that your data is really at risk. Limit data access. Not everybody in the company needs to have access to, most importantly, the most critical data. Think of it as a triangle. The more critical the data, the more valuable the data, the less people that should have access to it. Not only people inside your company, but the third-party people that you work with, because everybody that touches your data, if they are not compliant, if their systems of protecting data are not as stringent or as compliant as yours are, then you're at risk of being uncompliant because of them. Again, we're all connected, so there's no walls around the company to prevent this from happening anymore. Keys. What's a key? A key is the way that your data goes from inaccessible to accessible. So keys are comprised of a lot of different coding components, but for those of us who are basically customers of keys, what a key is your password. It's a multi-factor authentication method that you might have to use with your password, and that's how it works on the front end. But on the back end, whoever is giving you that key technology should not have access to those keys, so no back doors. The fewest people should know about your key. Ideally, your key is just yours and nobody else knows about it. And if you lose your key, that company should have a key escrow, so that is something that your key is stored away in case you lose it in a way that is very, very secure. And again, ideally, that company doesn't know anything more than it's stored there and you can access it if you need to. Don't just back up your data, archive your data. And here's what I mean by this. Back up the data that you use every day, but the stuff that's critical and valuable, you should archive it, because if it is apart from regular data, it's less accessible. If it is apart from regular data, you're not backing it up all the time, so it can save between 20 and 80% of your total cost of ownership per year, depending upon how much data you have. And as I referenced earlier, we're not only going to be storing in the cloud, we're going to be storing on optical media and disks and all kinds of things as time goes by. So this is something that you can do, again, to be more compliant with your data. Resilience and integrity checks on your most important data is very, very important too. When you have critical data, you should have many copies of it, both in the cloud, which is called hot storage, and also outside the cloud, which is called cold storage. So you want copies that are accessible to you and copies that are pretty much inaccessible unless there's an emergency. And those copies need to be checked, especially if you're in an industry that to be compliant, you need to store data for decades. When technology changes, what you need to think about is you're working with a company that can actually get that data for you no matter how technology changes, and it's still accessible to you in the form that you put it in. And that's something that very, very few companies are doing nowadays, but you should really find one and utilize their expertise. So this is the journey we've taken to Data Zen. And because I've given you so much information, what I wanted to do was just put it into a nutshell for you so that you can understand, although there's a lot of information and there are a lot of steps, especially if you're a company that doesn't know where your data is or has lots and lots and lots of data and you're thinking, I just don't want to even get started with this. Well, this is really, really easy, even though there's a lot of steps. You simply need to find the data. You need to classify it, consolidate and de-dupe it, erase the data you don't need, both in soft data and in hard data formats. Know your rules, the rules for your particular industry. Start at the federal level or the government level. If you're listening from other parts of the world, silo down to the state level, and then silo down to any rule that actually applies to your industry. Make sure that people have limited access. Valuable data, again, the more valuable it is, the less people should have access. Keep multiple copies, hot and cold storage, both online and off. Make sure the keys that access your data are erased after you sign off, something I didn't get to when we were talking about keys. Make sure that not only that you back up your data, but that you archive it as well, and that you give it resilience and integrity checks, particularly if you're going to be storing it for a very long time. At the end of the day, you're only as compliant and you're only as good as your data is. Thank you for being with me in this presentation. I hope it was useful. I hope it was basic enough to help you get your head around the fact that not only must you be compliant with your data, but that there are very linear steps to take to get you there. I enjoyed speaking with you today and look forward to hearing from you again. My contact information is there if you have any other questions or want to know more about how privacy and